what makes you different than other Christians? And the thing that I think that most of us would call to mind, would say first, is the prayer book. I think most of us would say that. I think we'd say that before we'd say our Constitution and canons. We'd say that before we say our budget. We'd probably say the Book of Common Prayer. And the Book of Common Prayer is authorized by this church, and it is authorized by General Convention. When people get together and figured out what they wanted to do as that liturgy, it was General Convention that made that book that book. And it's continued to do that in all of its revisions. I give you just a mental exercise to actually carry out through the rest of this morning. And that is, think of what are the best things about the Episcopal Church. And then ask yourself, how did they get there? How did they become things of the Episcopal Church? The question of structure and governance in the Episcopal Church is most influenced when people feel that the times have changed and the Episcopal Church is not meeting those times. That the things have changed in society and we sort of are not seeming relevant anymore. And that happened about 6 years ago in the Episcopal Church. There was just a run on that. There was just an angst, a kind of disappointment in the Episcopal Church among a lot of people. A lot of people had reasons for why those things happened, but many people thought that it was structural, that what the church needed to do was change. And there were several versions of what that change should be. And we came to the previous convention 3 years ago with a lot of those proposals floating around, and a decision was made not to attempt to make a decision about any of those proposals at that moment, but to bring people together to come up with a series of structural changes that would be presented at the convention that just passed. That was a group that we called TREC, right? And since I'm an Episcopalian, I can't remember what the letters stand for, right? Right, see, that's another test, you see. You see. If you're a real Episcopalian, you never mention whole words, right? That's right, you make anagrams are big. Okay, so that group reported to this General Convention. And out of that report, which almost every deputy, I think, read some of, if not the whole thing. Out of that report, I think, came a concern that the national, the office, the sort of bureaucracy, and the volunteers who supported the bureaucracy of the national church, and I use national church because I still haven't figured out a word to use for what is the office that runs the whole that is asked to serve the whole church. National is a bad word because we are the Episcopal Church has dioceses that are not in the United States. And so we call it the wider church. We haven't found the word that everybody will work on. We can call it the wider church this morning. Nice. And so the office for the wider church, right? People felt, and the volunteer groups that support that, people felt should be simplified. And we did that. And so we clarified what people's responsibilities were, and we actually increased, in certain places, the amount of authority that we gave to elected bodies inside the Episcopal Church. And we did that. It took a long time. We worked it all out. There was lots of details. We did it, and boom. That was done, and we're going to live through it. We're going to see if we think the Episcopal Church is any different 3 years from now than it is right now. We'll find out. Interesting stuff that happened. I think that what was remarkable about this convention and structure is that the convention figured out a way to deal with structure, and what they needed to do to deal with structure was not argue. And what was remarkable about this convention was that a whole range of things happened over the past 3 years that we came to this convention ready to talk to each other. And so we had actually 3 big structural changes that had never been recommended by TREC. The first one was to spend a good chunk of money on what we call mission work and evangelism, right? And it came out of the convention. It came off the floor, an amendment to the budget to spend $2 million+ on this, right? On all new programs that we're gonna have to figure out as we go along. The second thing was a real criticism of the way we were dealing with something that we think that we spend a lot of time on, but there's a lot of feeling that we're not doing it in as concrete and as useful a way as possible, and that is ending racism in the church and therefore becoming an institution to help end racism in this society. Anti-racism work. And again, we did that by the convention saying, look, we need to have a better group of people, right? That who takes responsibility for that work. And again, we will give them money to do that, but we want the leadership of the church to be responsible for this anti-racism work. We want the buck to stop with the president of the House of Deputies and the new presiding bishop. And fortunately, they figured out real fast that if they also added the vice presidents of both houses, they would be able to have a body of 4 people that, interestingly enough, without saying it, were half people of color. And included at least 1 woman, and I think we'll probably end up with 2, right? Interesting. And so that's the group. The top should be responsible for what you consider important. Right? And then finally, we finalized our work on marriage. I think that's a structural change. So we did the detail work, and then we did these big pieces. My remarks on governance.
So now I think we're open for questions, and Liz has a microphone and we'll come around to people who have questions. So what questions do we have for Byron on governance and structure?
I want to
Liz?
be clear that this microphone's not as good as those microphones, so you actually have to have it very close to your mouth for us to hear each other and for the people online to hear you.
And we also have, let me know if we have questions from people online. We have about 9 people joining us online, so know that there are others who are here with us. Anita.
Thank you, Byron. Question with regard to that first of the 3 structural changes. Can you be specific about that money that was not planned coming out of TREC that is now going to mission and evangelism? I've heard a bit about the evangelism with some new church plants, but I've not heard about that money for mission, and if that's been specifically denoted for certain programs.
And that money has not been specifically denoted yet, and we will expect that to be coming forward from the Executive Council, right? And let me just say, in terms of the simplicity of the church, now of simplifying the top structure of the church, we would usually, that would be sent to some standing commission, or that would exist through the next 3 years, and be reporting to Executive Council and to the next General Convention. We've done away with all of those. And so now we have 2 standing commissions, one on structure and constitution and canons, right? And the other one, what is our other structural commission? Why am I blanking on that? Liturgy and music. Liturgy and music. Oh, there's the prayer book. Of course, we're Episcopalians. Thank you. Right. Now, there can be task forces set up, but the idea was that all this work, bodies would only be called together to do work that needs to be done at that time. Essentially, we're going to be a church run by task forces and ad hoc groups.
I'm not sure if I'm playing by the rules by asking if it's okay to nominate a person for the Committee on Racism, but one of my new favorite people in the Diocese of Rhode Island is Del Glover. I'm hoping that he doesn't mind if I put his name forth. If you do, Del, I'm sorry. Forgive me, but I love you, and I think you'd be very helpful in that position.
Thank you so much for your remarks. I really enjoyed what you had to say, and your remarks about the authority of General Convention called to mind the blog post from Tom Crusty Old Dean Ferguson about his experience with General Convention delegates understanding the authority of General Convention either in a very broad metropolitical sense or alternately claiming that General Convention has no authority at all. And my question is twofold. Is that consistent with your experience, and what do you think should happen to educate the entire Episcopal Church about the authority of convention?
That's a really great question. And I think that on one hand, I do believe that we need to spend more time making sure that people, average Episcopalians, understand how things get done in the Episcopal Church. And my suggestion for that really is that if you want Episcopalians to believe that something's in the Bible, you write it in the prayer book, right? And right, you know that old story, right? Yeah, right. And the other piece of that, and I think that also applies to structure. I think we need to pray for the General Convention every day. I think the General Convention should be put into the prayers, all the versions of the prayers of the people, just like we pray for the presiding bishop. So we all know we have a presiding bishop, right? And most people who go to church, Episcopalians who go to church, know the name of the presiding bishop, and they'll know the name of the new presiding bishop very soon, right? Because that name will usually get mentioned in the prayers of the people. I think General Convention should be regularly prayed for, and so at least you get to a point where people could say, well, what is it? What am I praying for? Right. Now, on the other hand, I do think that it's okay for people to understand that things that they like about the Episcopal Church come from someplace, and that is the General Convention. And I'm happy to know that they appreciate the things the General Convention does. So I think the most remarkable thing, I think, that has happened in the Episcopal Church since 1979, am I right about that year, right, is that Episcopalians talk about baptism. Right? And there was no way you could get Episcopalians to talk about baptism. I mean, the average active Episcopalian talks about the baptismal covenant. It's most remarkable, right? And when I was baptized, my godparents were asked one question, right? Do it or not, and that was it, right? But the reason why we have the baptismal covenant is because of discussions and arguments by General Convention, and General Convention is the place that made it put it in the prayer book when it did the revision of that prayer book.
Other questions? Roger.
Byron, did the idea of a unicameral legislature ever get any traction?
Well, it certainly was talked about more at this convention than ever before because, of course, it was one of the TREC proposals. We did decide that we would revise any rules that prevented us from having debate and discussion together. Right now, the two houses meet together, but they meet together to be told things. So we get together and the budget is presented to us, but then we separate to go vote on the budget. And so we've never had we don't know what it would be like. And so it'd be interesting because of rules that keep us from doing that. And so it'd be interesting to have some sessions at General Convention where we meet together, talk about a resolution together, see how that works. So that kind of experimentation with some more active joint sessions will happen 3 years from now, and we will continue to think about it and talk about it.
Any question from the floor? I have a question, Byron, and that is, excuse me, you spoke of task force, and there was another word. Ad hoc committees.
Right.
How do those get formed?
They can be established by the presiding officers, and they can be established by executive committee, if they haven't been established by General Convention, right, already. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Any other questions for Byron on governance or structure?
So let me just say one thing before
Sure.
we move on to the
Yep.
next section, and that is I mentioned that we have a vice president of the House of Deputies. So most of the time of the existence of the House of Deputies, where the House of Deputies just had a president and a secretary, and then General Convention had a treasurer. And then the convention came to Massachusetts. I know there's no one here who was at that convention. Oh no, you were there? Oh, Acolyte at Symphony. The convention met at Symphony Hall. Were you there? Were you there when the president of?
For the Diocese of Arkansas, I think, and the bishop took us out to lunch.
Ah, got it. So, and it was the last time that the convention met without tables in front of them, right? And the deputies didn't have tables in front of them because they met in the Symphony Hall. And there was a tragedy at that convention, and that is the president of the House of Deputies died. During that time, during the convention, and so of course the people had to figure out what to do, and they appointed a ad hoc presider for the rest of the convention, and then people realized that it might be good to have a vice president. And of course it took, because they couldn't do that in 3 years. This is the Episcopal Church, so it took them about 6 years before they changed the canons, and they had to change the Constitution so we could have a vice president of the House of Deputies. So that's why there are very few when you get the list, it's a pretty short list compared to the list of presidents. But I want to say all of that because I am not the first black vice president of the House of Deputies. I just want to make people understand that. And the first black president of the House of Deputies is Dr. Charles Willey, who I see in the audience right now. And we had a great time. The president of the House of Deputies, Gay Jennings, invited Chuck Willey, as we call him here in Cambridge, and to visit the convention in Salt Lake City, and I think he had a good time, but we had a great time. There are more selfies with Dr. Charles Willey in this convention than probably anybody else except the new presiding bishop.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Byron. We're going to take a 5-minute break, so you can stand up and walk around, help yourself to food, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the environment. So have 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in on the commission.
Oh, no. Let's,
Okay, I didn't mean to.
huh? That's good history. That's right. That's right. Yeah, I don't think he died. I don't think they were meeting. I think he just didn't come back the next day. No, it was during convention though, yeah.
What year was that again?
And so that was when? That was 50, had to be in the, might have been, yeah, sometime in the 50s.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why that's why I won't let them come back anymore, you know. I think it's terrible for a diocese to have a convention. It's just too much work, drains,
Yeah, it drains all the
And-
energy
and-
out of the
right.
diocese
And so
for
I tell
years.
them, no, I don't think you want to come back. I don't think, I think
to my spiritual direction. So I have a place in my heart. So it was a classroom? It was a 3-level house, and we had a classroom, and then I don't know. Yes, you're watching it. That's right. But you had something to tell me?
Ian wants you to remember when we do questions again to just say again that people online can
Okay, great. Yeah, I just need it back. I said, okay, the only hard part is to remember. Right. Thank you. Oh, right.
He's going to go at the next break.
Sit in a lot of silence before we come to unity.
I'm talking to your Quaker daughter.
We're gonna, there's a reading in the final. Would you like to do this reading? Oh, no, that's the beginning.
Sure.
It's the end.
That one,
Howard
Loving God.
Thurman, is that, no, is this Howard Thurman? Can you, there he is, there he is.
Oh, sure, I'll do that.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that would be great, especially with the BU connection.
Yeah, good.
It's kind of nice to have all of your resolutions in a little, well, you had iPads that you had before, right?
Hmm?
You had iPads at convention.
Oh, yeah, but we couldn't, but we couldn't keep them.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why I couldn't bring the I stole the card. We were supposed to, we had a ID card.
Oh, okay.
And we were supposed to give these back, so that's actually my only thing, and I stole that.
Was that for the speaker podium?
And
No.
to vote.
To
You
vote.
stuck it in there.
It was so well done.
Yeah.
It was really well
Yeah,
done.
this is what kept you from voting more than once.
Wow. It was amazing
That's
on
right.
the floor.
So
Yeah.
that's right. Massachusetts, we tried to figure out a way to fudge the cards because we didn't believe we had to
Just one vote.
only once.
So they said
And
about
so if you-
Chicago, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to check with Ian, are we all set, and our people are back from the live stream? So we'll move now to the topic of environment, and Stephanie, we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm delighted to be here. Can you all hear me? Yes. Great. I just wanted to do a little bit of historical context also. Byron inspired me with his talk about the Episcopal Church history, and so I thought I'd spend a minute just sort of bringing everybody into the understanding about the environment and our community of faith. It's not new in the Episcopal Church, and in fact, the Episcopal Church has been extremely progressive in talking about God's creation. And from the first Earth Day in 1970, General Convention has voted consistently on environmental resolutions, including socially responsible investing that affects the ecology. Back then, we talked about it in terms of ecology. It's turned now into environment, and now a lot of us talk about it in terms of God's good creation. To give it that faithfulness, that sense of that this is not only a secular issue, but actually an issue and a concern of all of our life with God. So this conversation has continued for countless years at General Convention, resolutions that reflect the current events of our times, that relate to the environment and God's creation. And this General Convention was no different. Climate change was on people's heart. As you may have read in the paper this past week, these past 3 months were the warmest on record ever around the world. It wasn't just here that's had a hard summer, but also hard winter here in Boston. Our world is changing, and how does the church raise itself up and be faithful and hopeful in the face of all of this? It can seem overwhelming. It can seem like there's nothing I can do. And so I'm so delighted as a member of the Episcopal Church to know that we are on the leading edge of this, the people who are bringing the conversations to the forefront, the people who are engaging it in so many deep and powerful ways. And this General Convention did that in some terrific ways, in levels of engagement that were deep and thoughtful, that resulted in things that are going to change the way we think about a relationship to God's creation, I think, in the next years and in the years to come. Structurally, one of the most important things that came out of General Convention was, even though we're stepping away from committees, for this General Convention, there was an ad hoc committee formed for the first time called Environment Committee, and we called it Committee 16. And Committee 16 was charged solely with dealing with environmental resolutions. That should make you alert to the fact that there were so many resolutions for the first time, and a massive amount of resolutions that a committee specifically was focusing on this one issue. During previous conventions, environmental resolutions would go to the Liturgical Commission if it was about liturgy and worship, or for social justice, or for responsible investing. So the conversations in the church, at the parish, at the diocesan levels, in the communities of faith has been rising up so much that there were so many resolutions that were put forth, this special committee was formed. And because of this committee, because of the passion of the committee, things happened in ways that might not have happened in previous conventions. The one most significant, I believe, resolution that was passed was something called Divest and Reinvest. It's about fossil fuel divestment and reinvestment in clean energy. The Environment Committee received 5 resolutions from throughout the Episcopal Church, the wider Episcopal Church. Different dioceses, Nebraska, Western Mass, Massachusetts, California, and New York all submitted something about divesting from fossil fuel. It's been a big movement in Massachusetts. Many of you might have seen it in the institutions around you, universities, seminaries, other places of higher education are exploring divesting their holdings from fossil fuel. And so the faith communities have been gathering around this conversation. So the Episcopal Church was presented with some options on how to address this. And because Committee 16 was so organized and able to deal with it, they came up with this terrific resolution that actually invites the church and actually calls upon those who hold the fundings of the Episcopal Church to, in a fiscally responsible manner, divest from fossil fuel and reinvest in clean energy. It seems to me that the important part is the reinvesting. It's saying that we are hopeful about God's creation. We're hopeful about the future. We're hopeful that we can make a difference. So we're going to support things like wind and solar as a statement of faithfulness. There was some things that happened to the House of Bishops on the floor. Originally, the Church Pension Fund was in the resolution to be considered part of the divestment resolution. That was withdrawn during the debate in the House of Bishops. And so that's no longer on the table right now for the Church Pension Fund to divest their funding. So this divestment will happen over a period of time. It will be reinvestment into these new stocks. And the other part of the resolution that came forward was they were inviting all congregations of faith, parishes and dioceses, and I suppose even seminaries, to have a year-long conversation about what does divestment and reinvestment mean for your community. And it's a year-long study that the church has been invited into very specifically, very intentionally in this year. And so I'm part of a committee, an ad hoc committee called Fossil Free Episcopal Church, and we're working very hard to try to get information out about that. The other really exciting development that came also from this revisioning of structure came from a committee that I'm on that will no longer exist. It's one of those things that have been abolished in the restructuring, and it's the Science, Technology, and Faith Committee. And we had submitted a resolution about recognizing we're living in this new place and time, we're living in this new world of climate change, and how do we as a faith community respond? We have people who are climate refugees. We have people who don't know how to, who want to pray about it and who want to have worship about it. We have people who want to learn about solar panels. We have people who have all these different concerns. So how do we as a church offer these resources that are out there to the church and provide them more broadly to the church? The other part of the resolution was we wanted to state very carefully in the drafting of this resolution that we submitted that climate change is real, and that it was no longer a debate in the Episcopal Church. To us, it seemed like it was an important part, as we're sitting here in September and it's 80 degrees. So to us as a committee, the Science, Technology, and Faith Committee, it was a very clear statement of fact. Climate change is real. How is the church going to live faithfully into this new and changing world? there was a debate in the House of Bishops about whether or not this discussion should include various views of whether or not climate change existed. And so just to give you the broad sense of the church, I mean, we are a broad church, and there are different people with different views. And the debate continued, and ultimately the House of Bishops decided that no, climate change, by affirming this resolution, does exist, and it is real, and humans have been participating and contributing to that. So the result of this resolution was a task force that will have one representative from each province, since provinces were not abolished in this round of convention. And they will gather and figure out what each province needs to do in their own local conditions. The people in Alaska who are actually climate refugees, who are moving off their property, have a very different issue than the people who are dealing with drought in California or tremendous snowfall in Boston. And so climate change is a very local issue, even though for the church it's also a broader issue of justice. So this task force is charged with being formed beginning in April of next year, and they will also be responsible for the funding that has been allocated by the church during the budget process. I want to talk a bit about the budget process because it was important to the conversation about the environment. You know, we have our funding into 5 marks of mission. That we tend to, the past 2 general conventions, funding's been allocated into the 5 marks of mission: church planting, evangelism, baptize, teaching and learning, these broad categories. The 5th category is the 5th mark of mission about the integrity of creation. In the 5 marks of mission, there's about $35 million allocated over the course of 3 years. In the previous triennium, $500,000 was allocated to care of creation. In the early stages of the budget process in the church, beginning in January, $250,000 was originally allocated to take care of creation, to do all of this work we're talking about. And as the process evolved, with fine people like Anita and Steve working alongside many of us, we were able to engage in conversation and sort of petition all of these processes to add additional funds into that 5th mark of mission, and ultimately $750,000 was allocated for this particular mark. That meant that other marks had to lose some money, and there was some fine discussions and a lot of passion about each area of concern. But I do think it's a statement of endorsement from the church when more money's put in. That was a 30% increase on the floor of convention, recognizing this was an important issue. And recognizing that that money needed to be spent in a thoughtful way, which is why this newly formed task force will be responsible for developing programs. It's this collaborative effort that sort of infused General Convention, I think, this sense of we're all working together. How do we be creative? The budget process was very open and very responsive, and so, to me, that was an amazing outcome at the end. That this increase came from hundreds of people sending in emails. We had hundreds of people saying the integrity of creation is important, and the budget committee heard that. And so it was a remarkable process of people around the wider church responding and realizing that they have a voice. And I think technology allows us to do that in ways that might not have always been possible in the past. There were other resolutions on the Environment Committee, which I'm not going to go into. But we can talk about them. There, at some point, if there were questions, there were things about food systems, GMOs. There was an important one about environmental racism that it was a good resolution. I'm not sure how it's going to be implemented. Some of them didn't pass, and some other resolutions just sort of have been languishing. And I do want to talk about one that has to do with the baptismal covenant, and it was a project that I've been working on with people in the Diocese of Connecticut. And we realized that because the baptismal covenant is so transformative to how our understanding of justice, that maybe we should explore the idea of adding some changes to the covenantal language that talks specifically about God's good creation. And so the Diocese of Connecticut formed a task force, a year-long task force, and we had a diocesan-wide discernment where we actually, through technology, through surveys, through small group meetings, about 30 different congregations met over the course of a year to talk about baptismal covenant language. And they came up with a proposed new statement which said, Will you cherish the wondrous works of God and protect the beauty and integrity of all creation? And so the idea was there would be a sixth sentence. As Byron said, when he was baptized, there was one, and now the suggestion was maybe we need a new one that really engages us more deeply. And so the Diocese of Connecticut put it forth to the Liturgy and Music Commission, who decided to table it in light of the prayer book revision process. The other part of the conversation was that two things that happened from this conversation. There are some dioceses, their diocesan bishops have authorized the use of this covenantal language as a pilot, as a trial within the diocese. So I do know of some dioceses that are using it and people are exploring it, and there's been a positive response. And the Church of Canada adopted a very similar statement and added it to their baptismal covenant this summer. So it's that sort of thing that people are thinking about. It's not only action. One more point, turn off the lights for God's sake. The idea of it was that it wasn't only an action, but it was actually an offering to God. It was sort of, we're engaging our faith and our heart and our whole being in taking care of God's earth. And so the baptismal covenant was one entryway. There will be other entryways, I think, in the future as we explore different ways of engaging these conversations. So that's how the baptismal covenant did not get out of committee, but the conversation it provoked is almost equally as valuable. I mean, we would like to have seen it pass from Connecticut, but it didn't. And we'd like to have seen it moved on, and it didn't. And yet people were talking about it in the hallways, and people were talking about it in General Convention, as they always do, and about, well, what does it mean? Why is it happening? And sometimes that's as valuable. So it was an amazing convention for so many reasons. And it was pretty incredible to be part of these conversations. So, any questions, comments?
On? Can you hear me? Okay. Great job. Nice to have you there in this very important position. Carry on. Good luck.
I was a bit of a gadfly, walking the halls with my flyers, talking to everybody.
I'm wondering who the members of the group of 16 were, or the committee, the 16 members, and who appointed them. Is that not significant? I'm sure it is.
It is significant. They were, the House of Bishops was appointed by the presiding bishop, and there was a cohort of bishops who have been doing this work in their diocese in passionate and important ways. And not only in their diocese, but in the example of Andy Dici from New York, he's actually on the Anglican bishops, Eco-Anglican bishops. So you had that sort of depth of understanding and engagement that they've been doing this for a long time. The House of Deputies was appointed by Kay Jennings, and she did an equally stellar job of appointing people who were doing this work in their diocese. People put forth their names, but they basically put forth their credentials. And the House of Deputies group was chaired by Ellen Tilliston, who is an amazing person who knows processes and organizations, and General Convention has been going there for years. So she knew the combination of passion in that committee of understanding about God's creation and their understanding of the structural processes of getting something done at convention made it extraordinary, just extraordinary. So I think that made the difference, why there were so many successes and so many things that were thoughtfully recreated.
Well, right before Anita starts, I just want to put another pitch in for questions from our online audience. So please do enter a question in the chat, and we'll bring it to the floor.
I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
The first one is this committee of 16. Now, am I understanding this, Stephanie, that there's a new committee now that's going to, and who is on that committee?
So the new task force, there will be one person appointed from each province, and that'll be church-wide, the Episcopal Church of everywhere, right? Well, however we're going to describe it. So the larger Episcopal Church will have a task force. There'll be 9 members on that.
Okay.
And those members will each help organize within their province individual task forces to respond to the local concerns. And so if our province, I mean, we're pretty organized in Province 1 doing this stuff. we will gather together, this group, and there'll be other appointments. There'll be 5 to 10 people who are appointed to the provincial group by the province structure. And then they will do their work. They will have funding for their work, and that work will be translated, shared with the larger task force. So it's like this 2-tiered structure, local and then national church. And they are funded, so, which is unusual. I mean, that doesn't always happen. So just to get together for a meeting, there's going to be money for that, and there's going to be money to do projects. And some of their recommendations are liturgical resources, you know, helping connect people to energy resources, community building, things like that.
So the question that goes with that then is, and this is, I don't mean to sound jaded, I'm a very positive, optimistic person. Implementation. How do these, I mean, all these wonderful things, and how is it ultimately through the diocesan level that this comes to the, like me, the local parish priest, so that this incredible work is implemented?
Right. So it depends on whether or not you have a robust, in some ways I think it depends on the provincial structure, because I think this is going to go back to, remember, you have 9 people on the national task force. You have 9 provincial individual structures who are developing work within their provinces, and whoever is organizing at the provincial level will be responsible for sharing the information to parishes, to dioceses. Not every diocese is going to have a person on the task force necessarily, just because of the size of the church. And so the other thing is interesting to me is the resolution is very specific about having people who are environmental professionals on there. So there's a whole range of very specific skill set they're looking for. And I think time will tell. I think that the fact that there is funding for it, there's a pretty well-structured layout already, so it's not going to be a year and a half of figuring out how it's going to organize itself. It's going to be very helpful.
So my last question, if I'm not taking too much of the microphone, is this the same task force as the Science, Technology, and Faith Task Force, or is that a different one?
No. So the Science, Technology, and Faith is one of the CCABs, the commissions, committees, advisory boards that have been abolished. So our committee, which had submitted a series of resolutions for General Convention, no longer exists, I suppose, at the end of this year, the end of the triennium. And so we no longer are there. And this task force is just a new iteration of it. It's one of these responsive task force that Byron was talking about, that there's a need, there's money, we need to figure out how to do it. So it won't be, it might necessarily be a long-standing task force. I think it might. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
May I add something just about implementation? I really think that, and I think we sensed it in this convention, but I believe that over the past several years in the Episcopal Church, we've gotten away from grassroots organizing. We've gotten away from saying, if we want something to happen in the Episcopal Church, we are all ministers, let's get together and go do it. And then we bring out of that work on the ground, we bring resolutions to General Convention for 2 reasons: to educate the rest of the church, but also to see that the resources that are available to the wider church can get coordinated in this way. We should really remember that. We should remember that it wasn't the Episcopal Church, that it wasn't the General Convention at the beginning of the 20th century that got the Episcopal Church to focus on peace, to understand itself as a church that had to that needed to raise the issues of peace and nonviolence in this world. That was a group of Episcopalians who went out there and did it. And bishops had to resign, and people got in lots of trouble, and the Episcopalians just stayed at it. And of course, the one that we never want to talk about anymore because they won is to go back in the 19th century and remember that when the Episcopal Church was founded, that you would not go into any church in the new Episcopal Church in 1800 and see candles on an altar. You wouldn't even see an altar. And the whole movement of bringing in Catholic liturgy and Catholic ritual into this church was a grassroots campaign. right? A grassroots campaign, and so we forget that, and you can have, and that's the way this organizing needs to go on. And so, if things are not happening over the next 3 years that you thought should be happening, right, then let's see the local manifestation of those things. And 3 years from now, come and bring examples of the local manifestation of those things.
Thank you, Byron. And more questions about the environmental issues? Yes.
I'd like to see crossover, and I would like to hear how the environment is working with the justice people, perhaps the economic justice people, most importantly.
So the Episcopal Ecological Network's been around for, I think it was an act of convention. I'm not sure exactly what year. And it's sort of a loose network of folks all over the country. I think there's several thousand people on sort of websites and emails that we share information. And very consciously this year, in advance of convention, we started to meet via conference call with the Economic Justice Group. And so even at convention, we shared a booth with them and sort of said that these are all similar related issues. Justice is justice. And so there was that sort of crossover of these very grassroots sort of informal ad hoc groups that are out there. That's my small understanding of what's been going on.
Thank you. Stephanie, are there other words you wanted to share about those things that you didn't get to talk about in your presentation? Or a last word you'd like to have?
No, I just think that, I think Byron's point is so well taken. You know, I travel all over talking about this, and I am always so delighted to find out how many people are doing this work for God's creation, and they've been doing it for so long in such passionate and giving and caring ways. And so there is this grassroots movement. It's just sometimes people find it hard to figure out how to connect.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sort of what the role of the church is. How do we help people realize that you don't have to invent anything. It's already out there, because people like Anita and Steve and countless other people all over are doing really amazing things. And how do we let people in Seattle know what Anita's doing in her church? So I think that's the role the church can play. And that's why I'm excited about this task force, because I think just sitting in the room with other people from all over will bring us into that conversation of sharing. And I think that's the new church that we're reimagining as we're living into it.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, Stephanie. So we have time for another 5-minute break, and we may not take all of that 5 minutes, but just know that this is a time to get up and move around, and we'll have a little change of energy. Thank you.
Great job. Oh, thank you. So many good things going on.
Yeah, they really are. Have you read there's a novel by David Mitchell called
Okay.
Clocks?
No.
It's just,
reaction to it.
yeah, I'm just intrigued by it.
But I thought, remember,
You
I talked to
suggested
you
it.
about that you do one on gender.
Yeah, and it could still happen.
Yeah, oh, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
I've thought about it, and I,
Right. And I tried to get people to do one on race, and they just felt they wouldn't be taken seriously. It turned out the bottom line that what the committee did, right? Except they didn't have a memorial to refer it to. They could say we're doing these things because of what people said in this document.
yeah. So it's just, yeah, the relationship of the grassroots work to
Yeah, exactly.
both
Say-
to general convention resolutions
Right.
and to memorials. Oh, okay. Anyway, yeah, because I took.
I'm going to welcome you back to this circle, and we'll be ready for Cameron. Cameron will be speaking on the resolutions that were involved in marriage. Thank you, Cameron.
Hello.
Hello.
So yes, I am going to speak about the resolutions related to marriage, but more than that, if I could sort of frame what I want to say a little bit more broadly, it's about resolutions related to gender and sexuality, or even more broadly than that, I would think, and this kind of, in a way, connects with the previous panelists have said, to collective embodiment. If we can think about ourselves as collectively embodied, and of our, we're at a time in the life of our church where that collective body is changing in ways that we can perceive. Structurally, we engage with that change structurally, we engage with that change liturgically, we engage with that change in other ways. But if we think about it in a broader theological way in terms of our collective embodiment, that might be an interesting way to see some of the interconnections between what all of us have been saying. So the resolutions that I want to address in particular are indeed related to marriage, but also to transgender people and to LGBT people more broadly in ways that are not marriage specific. So I'm actually going to start with the resolutions related to trans people, which are a great example of grassroots organizing and things bubbling up in the church and coming forward to the larger church through those sorts of through things that are happening on the ground, and then responsiveness within the wider body of the church to help respond to that. So DO36 was a resolution adding a name change right to the Book of Occasional Services. And, you know, that's a resolution that was sponsored by Edwin Johnson of our Diocese of Massachusetts. It came up out of a group Trans-Episcopal and with broader Trans-Episcopalians in the Episcopal Church, and came from experiences of transgender people in congregational life longing for congregations to support and liturgically acknowledge the significance of their names and of being rightly named. And that is a matter of honoring the human dignity of all, which we indeed affirm in our baptismal covenants. Liturgically, having a service in the Book of Occasional Services was one of the things that that people in the community really longed for, or not necessarily specific to the Book of Occasional Services, but if we were going to have a liturgy or rite that would affirm that and give some structure and some guidance to congregations that indeed do this already, why not piggyback it on the proposed changes to the overall Book of Occasional Services that was already being floated by the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music. So this resolution, DO36, asked for that change of the Book of Occasional Services to include a name change right, which actually already existed in the book called Changes, Prayers and Services Honoring Rites of Passage, which the proposed change to the Book of Occasional Services was already going to be drawing on other liturgies from that resource anyway. So we said, well, why not also include the name change right? Being at convention was powerful to find that there were trans folks that I helped organize to go to the open hearings and testify about the significance of being able to have such a service. And other folks who were there talked about the experience of already doing such services or being asked to do such services. So that was a very positive experience, and the resolution got amended a little bit to make it so that right in the book changes could be consulted, but it didn't necessarily have to be that it would be the right necessarily that would be in the new Book of Occasional Services, but that they should consult more broadly as well. So that got passed, and it was passed without debate in either houses, and that was a major significant thing for trans folks in the Episcopal Church. As someone who's trans myself, and have been in conversation with people in the church since about being trans in the church since the mid 2000s. Having a liturgy to honor name changes was one of the very first sorts of requests that I ever heard. So for me, it was a huge moment to have that be come forward in this way. So it still has to be generated. It still has to come into the Book of Occasional Services, and that book itself will still need to be passed, approved at the next General Convention. So it's not a done thing, but this particular step was a very big deal. DO37, amending names in church records, registries, and certificates, also was a very big deal. Again, came out of grassroots connection and organizing in the Episcopal Church. And in this case, it came from people, and this affects transgender people, but it's much broader than that. Similarly, the name change liturgy affects, trans people are not the only people who change their names, and this can affect many, many people, and people testified to that effect as well. But in DO37 around church records, registries, and certificates, the sort of pastoral need that emerged, and again has been coming to me and others since at least the mid-aughts, was when people do change their names, they can have their histories inadvertently or not inadvertently disclosed in ways that they would not like in other congregational settings. Say you're baptized under a particular name and that's in the record, and then you go to another congregation as you get older and move or whatever, and your baptismal records are transferred over at some point. Suddenly, your history is disclosed in a way that you might not want. Plenty of transgender people are openly so, but even if we are, we don't necessarily disclose our previous names. And sometimes that nuance can be lost on folks, and it's actually a very big deal. So this resolution called for a study. It's not even calling for a definitive, this is exactly what will happen, but it's calling for a study that will consult transgender people as well as several other groups that are who have wisdom to add to this about how we might amend church records and certificates, like ordination certificates, for instance, in ways that will honor the needs for privacy for anybody whose name would be changed. In the House of Deputies, this did come to the floor in a really powerful debate or conversation in which non-transgender people stood up and spoke about how powerful this the need was for this. One mother spoke about her daughter. The mother's, if I'm remembering correctly, husband had left, and it had had a profound impact on the daughter, and it was some sort of deeply affecting circumstance, and the daughter had not wanted to be baptized until she could legally change her name to the same last name as her mother, to really honor that connection and disconnect from the last name of her father. And the fact that she wanted to wait to be baptized until that had happened shows that there had been the power of the names as they're registered. And so that was a story that had nothing to do with anyone trans, and it really shows how broadly applicable and how powerful this sort of thing is. So, and also Frederica Tomset testified in that same conversation, that same debate, about wanting everyone to feel able to proudly hang their baptismal certificates on their wall. That it's really a matter of your baptismal identity as a Christian, and that you should be able to have the name that honors who you are be up on your wall. And I thought, that's wonderful. It's just wonderful, and very in keeping with Frederica, and I loved it. So that passed. It was amended. There were some groups that had been previously named to be part of the consulting groups that were removed, and another one that was added. The one that was added was the National Episcopal Historians and Archivists. So I look forward to seeing that study happen, and that a resolution should come out of that, I would think, at the next convention to clarify exactly how we're going to handle that. Now, marriage, I was on the marriage task force, so over the last 3 years, and so that task force was in A037. There was a pass to continue the work of that task force, but not so much with respect to marriage as with respect to how we even talk about sexuality, about family. I can say as a member of that task force that part of what we found to be true was that there were a lot of questions that were coming up that were outside the purview that were beyond what we could possibly cover. And sort of broader discussions about sexuality, which have been ongoing, but which aren't resolved. And I don't think, I think this is always going to be a conversation we should be having in one way or another, hopefully not in rancorous ways, but in ways that honor its importance. So that committee has been pledged to be continued, and I don't know. I assume that's going to be appointed in the next sometime after January. A036 was the resolution that the task force generated in addition to our report. And it's really, I'll say, it's the report that I, as a task force member, had the most, I was invested in all of it, but as somebody who wrote and sweated and stayed up nights over the last several years, that, it's really what I wrote in the report that matters the most to me. And I supported A036, which called for changing, amending the Marriage Canon 118 to remove language that was gender specific, and to reorder the canon in a way that made more sense in terms of pastoral practice. There were things that were changed about that didn't have anything to do necessarily with questions around marriage equality, same-sex couples, different-sex couples. But, for instance, the Declaration of Consent, the language of that was changed in a way that recognized the reality that many folks in the church marry people of different faith traditions, and to ask both members of the couple to sign a marriage declaration of consent that was only coming out of the Christian tradition might not make sense for say, a Christian Jewish couple or a Christian Muslim couple. So that was, and there was some debate about that language, actually. There was an attempt to make it more Christian again, and that ultimately didn't succeed at the end of the day. So there is a declaration, but it is constructed in such a way that it's got an openness to it. So that's to say that the resolution about amending the marriage canon was not only addressing same-sex marriage or just marriage equality, but it was broader than that, and it was seeking to have in mind kind of the practical theological ordering that comes out of preparing people for marriage and doing marriage in the Episcopal Church. A054 added, that was generated by the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music. The Marriage Task Force wasn't connected with that process. That was generated out of the SCLM, and it added liturgical rites for marriage that were not gender specific. So in a world where the marriage canons were changed, there are now liturgies that could be that are authorized through the General Convention. They were adaptations of the marriage service in the Book of Common Prayer from 1979, as well as an adaptation, slight adaptation of "I will bless you and you will be a blessing," the marriage the liturgy that came out of that to make it clearly marriage. It also authorized a blessing, the "I will bless you" liturgy, to be used in those areas of the Episcopal Church that don't have legal marriage equality, because we are our church. In our church wideness, we go beyond the U.S. I was intrigued and sometimes amused by the debate over a third rite, which was an adaptation of the 1928 marriage liturgy, which had been made accessible for same-sex couples, but in debate in the House of Bishops, that got excised, and that debate was hilarious, and I really want a transcript of it. I'm serious. If anyone has it, I want it, and I could tell you why. As I've just been reading, actually, Louis Crew Clay's soon-to-be-released memoir through Church Publishing, and I wrote a blurb for it. And he and Ernest used the 1928 marriage rite in a private service decades ago. And so I was reminded of, I'm sort of intrigued by the connection of that particular liturgy to marriage equality. So a research project for some time. I've mentioned a bunch. I'll just briefly say there was also an anti is not the right word, but a resolution that was critiquing and opposing so-called reparative therapies that are sometimes practiced to have LGBT people, try to have them not be LGBT or to not practice their sexuality and or transition in terms of gender. So that passed. That was DO 28. There was also AO51, LGBT African advocacy, honoring the advocacy that's coming out of different contexts in Africa that support LGBT people in those contexts, and seeking to support them without imposing in a kind of neo-colonial way. So that also passed. There's more. There was actually a lot under the rubric of sort of gender and sexuality. I think that it's interesting to think about them through a structural lens, and I think I also want to think about structural change, as I said at the beginning, through the lens of collective embodiment. That as we change our structures, we are acknowledging the ways in which we collectively, as a collective body of Christ, are already being transformed. And the question is sort of how do we want to engage that transformation and honor it, and how do we not want to be transformed? And how do we honor our interconnectivity, honor the ways in which all our changing impacts all of us, even though our agency might feel differently, and we might feel differently impacted because of our identities within that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And so we have some times for questions or comments on marriage and the broader issue of sexuality. Anita?
I know I'm asking questions. These are, as the local parish priest, is all the practical implementation. So when do these resolutions go in effect?
In January is my understanding.
Right. All canons go into effect in January unless if it's written into the canon to go into effect.
And none
earlier.
of these were written into the canon before January, the ones you've referenced, Cameron.
In
Right,
terms of
but
the
it depends on what you want to do. So if you think about this.
Oh, I am.
Right, and I'm
I have November
this is why-
7th. I have a
this is-
wedding
this
on
is-
November 7th. I'm
That's
thinking
right,
about it.
Right. So, and this is why you always want to have one of the presiding officers of the House of Deputies be a layperson, right? You know that if the president is a clergy person, the vice president has to be a layperson, and vice versa, right? So that I can say things that I can't get into trouble. Right?
Yes.
And that is, do it. do it. Think about how long it takes for them to catch you. By the time they,
This is
by-
public knowledge here. I'm
by
on
the
I'm on the
time- by
camera.
time- no, by the time the letter is written and all of that kind of stuff, it'll be
Okay.
January.
All right.
So, well,
Okay.
but also, I mean, there are dioceses, I don't know, there are dioceses where already,
Right.
you can do marriages of same-sex couples.
Yes.
Because you've been, like in Diocese of Massachusetts, we can do that already. And we have been able to since 2000, is it 12 or 9? I can't, now what's my brain? But using either the I Will Bless You and You'll Be a Blessing liturgy, which was specifically
Right.
given to us for that purpose, or an adaptation of it, or an adaptation of the Book of Common Prayer, which you can get permission from your bishop to do. Now,
Yes.
in some dioceses, that's not already authorized, and that's where the January deadline will feel
Okay.
quite different.
Yeah.
But they're already, and there's much that one can already do,
Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
even
and
without what
I know.
Byron's
Okay.
loophole.
I know. Not while I'm on camera now. I've just revealed myself. Okay. Thank you.
And now it's all public.
Well, and that's true around, you all may have or may know folks with trans people or non-trans people who want to honor a name change in their congregation, and already it is possible to honor that liturgically. Often in connection with the baptismal covenant reaffirmation, and that has been happening. The resources exist, and we're trying to lift them up and think more carefully and constructively about them through this process over the next 3 years. But that doesn't mean that you can't do it now. There's no prohibition now. So
Now this, and just say a word, that this task force is continuing. right?
yeah,
On-
so the marriage,
right.
yeah, so AO37 continues the work of the task force on marriage. As I mentioned, came out of the strong experience that we had, that there were questions about, is marriage the only rubric under which we can even talk about sexuality at all? Like that was really, and it's like, I hope that's not the only rubric under which we can talk about sexuality. And can we have a conversation about that? Can we think about how we would do that? Because there can be an incredible silencing effect if we just filter everything through marriage. I say that as somebody who works in campus ministry and with young adults more broadly. We have to be able to, how can we talk about a kind of Christian ethic of sexuality without just always only kind of containing it in a very specific way? And if so, how might we go about doing that? And that's why that we felt like it's such an important question, and it came. I know as a task force member, I received communications from people saying, "Can we please not make marriage the only form of relationship that's important to us as a church? Can we please honor people who don't feel called to marriage?" So that caused me to think about marriage even more through a vocational lens, and to think about relationships in general through a vocational lens. So what if we, so anyway, but it clearly went beyond, we were really tasked with thinking and working with marriage. So we were sort of noticing a whole territory which we would like to talk more about, we would like to engage others in talking more about. So that's why we propose that it be continued.
Right. Another interesting question is the continuing phrase in the canons that you can't marry people who cannot be married legally in the state.
Yep.
Now, this, of course, would have been a little different if the Supreme Court case hadn't just happened. But historically, this has been just an incredibly confining canon, because this, and I've actually asked this question of people who were around before the Loving case. Could they give me examples of Episcopal priests who would marry interracial couples in states where it was illegal? And no one has ever found me one. I've never, so if you ever find one, there's another research piece. I'd be like to hear that story. But, and so why should that be? I mean, why is our definition of marriage, right, always connected with the state law, even though we know that we have lived through state laws that have been so oppressive when it comes to couples, not only same-sex couples, but in our lifetime, interracial couples.
Absolutely.
Liz?
Thank you so much. I'd like to follow on in a way from that. As someone whose own support for marriage equality came about through an understanding of marriage as a sacrament, and as a sacrament that I don't believe the church has the authority to deny to people on the basis of their sexual orientation. I'm curious as to whether any part of this conversation touched on theology or liturgical theology, because I'm sure you can find plenty of Episcopalians who deny that marriage even is a sacrament.
Right.
So I'd like to hear about that dimension.
The theological dimensions were the ones that mattered the most to me. At the end of the day, it was like I wasn't actually sure what resolutions were going to come out of our committee or not, honestly, but what did matter to me was that we would think theologically about marriage. I mean, I'm in support of marriage equality, like that shouldn't be mistaken, but like I didn't know. But what really mattered, what we specifically should generate or what was going to be generated elsewhere, whatever, but like the theology of it was what really mattered to me. And it's interesting, like within the Episcopal Church, some would call marriage a sacrament, others would, I mean, technically it's a sacramental rite. And, but so the sort of theology of sacrament at all was part of what we talked about. For me, the theological angle that it generates that's kind of most interesting, but I do think the angle you're raising around sacrament and sacramentality is incredibly important. But for me, the most interesting angle was our theology of the human person, our theological anthropology. And I think in the Episcopal Church, we haven't often, there's no official document that sort of establishes some sort of notion of gender complementarity or sexual complementarity, but in the Roman Catholic and evangelical context, that certainly is the case of how marriage equality has been pushed back against, because it undermines on that sort of argument a notion of gender complementarity, right? So, but I think oftentimes there's like an unofficial level at which it functions in our church, and what happens is that gets challenged, but because we don't usually talk about it in those terms, we aren't quite sure how it's being disrupted, and so I think a lot of our conceptions of gender and sexuality that are heteronormative, if you will, get challenged and disrupted by marriage equality, but we don't necessarily recognize that. And so that gets to our theology of the human person, and a much more expansive theology of the human person, in fact, which we have been working on for decades. With respect to a lot of different demographic categories. Race, gender, especially when we think about women's ordination, economic class, I think is still part of that conversation in interesting ways. Sexuality, I mean, they're all part of our understanding of, our theological understanding of the human person. I think our baptismal covenant helps us in that work and has been an important help to us in that work. And in other ways, it's got a breadth to it that's been really helpful. Sometimes I think other sorts of theological lenses can help us clarify what we're doing in ways that we might not always be totally aware of. So, yeah, I know I was like a drumbeat on theology, which is why I was in the subgroup that was the biblical and theological dimensions of marriage. We had 3 subgroupings within our committee, and that's yeah, so I'm happy to talk ad nauseum with you offline about that.
Other questions or comments for Cameron? Thank you, Cameron. Thank you for your presentation.
Absolutely.
So we have some time now to be in conversation, all of us together, in thinking about the implications for all that went on at convention, both the resolutions that we have heard about today, but other things that have happened. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was truly amazed, very pleasantly surprised. It's about time when Bishop Curry was elected to be the next presiding bishop. I think that was a wonderful moment in the history of the church and deserves a hallelujah, but also it's about time. Now, I know that there were some other candidates that brought some very strong credentials to the table, although it was my impression that no one was really running. It was politely done. Probably not, but anyway. I'm hoping that Bishop Curry will not overlook those who were in, quote, competition with him. A lot of them brought some gifts to the table that should not be overlooked. And I'm hoping that, we can keep them all, at the table.
Thank
That's just for you, Bishop Curry, I guess.
Thank you. Go ahead,
I was just gonna, in that same spirit, I know one of the things you said at the beginning, Byron, was that we really came to convention ready to talk. I found that to be true as well, and that the sort of the importance of relationship and of trying to get to step out of certain kind of ruts of ways in which we've been engaging or missing each other or clashing with each other. I feel like there's a way in which those are starting to erode, and I hope that that spirit just continues to happen. I know I was on a panel at one point on defining marriage, which brought together people who are, really different theological positions on that, and it had moments of hilarity and clarity about exactly where we disagreed, but a sense of collegiality and of even friendship, and that was really valuable to me. So I hope that spirit continues to be with us in the coming triennium and obviously beyond.
I want to just follow up on that. I think that I think there are a lot of people that, and you just look at the people who ran for General Convention, there are a lot of people who thought General Convention was not going to be a good time. So we had a lot of people who actually did not run. And so when we were heading into convention and we looked at this very large number of new deputies, I think that Gay Jennings, the president, certainly was very conscious of how to set a tone for that. Now, we had already been concerned about the fact that we tell people that we have rules for how we operate when we get together. And most people thought that those rules were arcane, and many people thought that those rules were used by the people who could really understand them. And so Gay, 3 years ago, at the end of that convention, brought together a few of us to talk about revising the rules. And we were in a meeting that lasted for about 5 minutes, and we said we didn't think that was possible. So let's just rewrite them from scratch. And we did that, and the convention adopted that. And I think that just that relaxed a lot of people, because everybody that voted for something that they had read and understood, was written in language that was explicable. And I think they felt a lot more comfortable in the whole process from then on. There are several things like that, but that was one of the key ones, to get this new mood in convention. So I'm expecting lots of people to be running for convention in 3 years from now, and I'm hoping that we can make sure that we do all the things to keep this same mood into the convention when it meets in 18. Huh?
Yeah.
50, huh?
2018.
2018 in Austin, Texas, and we want you to work on the climate.
It's not going to be hot. I want to affirm that, because in Indianapolis there was so much fear. I think there was the atmosphere was heavy, and there was sort of anxiety and fear building up, and maybe that's why people chose not to re-up for the next, put their names forward to be deputies, why there was a big group of new deputies. But I do think that there was a sense of joy in the gathering that particularly Gay showed throughout the process, and it was easy to laugh, and it was easy to be joyful and be hopeful in God because we were laughing. I mean, there's something about laughter that is inherent to joyfulness, and I think that when you get bogged down in procedural stuff, you forget about that.
That's right. And it was helpful to have a chaplain that made us sing.
And I was going to say the chaplain, I mean, at one point the chaplain called everybody to the front, and then you had 800 deputies all like praying in this little circle. I mean, it was those moments as an observer that said, you know, the church is alive and growing, and God is in the midst of all of this. Even in the midst of Robert's rules and procedures and all the other stuff. So, you know, I do commend you and the leadership there for changing the dynamics and bringing so much joy. So people should want to be deputies. If you're watching at home, I mean, yeah.
Right.
You don't have to carry that big blue book anymore either. You got a little thing, you got an iPad. No, you don't have to be strong.
I have a question related to that, because that's what's really stood out in your presentations, is the joy, the hope, the prayerfulness of a decision-making body, which is just often not true. And I'm wondering I haven't heard that in our congregations. I haven't heard people saying, "Oh, I'm so excited that General Convention was so joyful." So, and that seems really important. And I'm wondering if there are people who are communicating that, are feeling like this General Convention is the beginning of a new thing, and how can we do that more? What's your advice for doing it more, and are we already doing this communicating joy, hope, prayerfulness in the work of the Episcopal Church? Because I have to say I didn't feel that way when I walked in, and I do feel that way having listened to the three of you.
Well, I hopefully that is happening. Now, this is, you know, the reporting back it's just started, you know, because we're the only denomination that goes on vacation. And so August is over. And so people are back, and you're gonna those report backs are gonna be happening like this one, and they'll be going on at diocesan conventions when those resume this fall. So we'll see what that is. I hope that that the form it takes, that there is enough said in this convention, and enough that has been recognized about the work that Episcopalians are doing throughout the church, especially for justice, that those people who are doing that work connect with each other more, that they reinvigorate their hopefulness, and that as much of that as possible gets communicated to General Convention, so it can be that General Convention continues and expands that task of educating everybody in the church. One of the interesting things about if you look around at churches, denominations that are growing, and especially smaller denominations that are growing, is that they love to get together. And so you talk to people in the Church of God in Christ, and they get together, as many as can afford it, every year, right? And until about a few years ago, they always went to their founding city. They went to Memphis, right? and so you'd go into Memphis at that time of the summer, and the whole city was covered with signs saying "Welcome Saints." and so I think that we should really think seriously about whether convention is too small. And maybe we should have more people going to convention for being together. And think about it. The average size of an Episcopal congregation is what, 125? Is that the number? Something like that.
Smaller, I think.
Huh? It's lower. It's lower. And so think about this. It means that the only time that those members of that congregation have seen bunches of Episcopalians together is when they probably did the consecration for the bishop in their diocese. They never have that experience. They never have the experience of hearing a congregation sing all those hymns with no choir. And so I think there are lots of advantages for congregations to just decide on raising a few bucks and sending a few people to convention just to observe. They don't have to spend the whole time. But I think that we need to get more people coming to this event.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, we can start close to the grassroots level with, weekly church dinners, monthly deanery meetings, quarterly diocesan meetings, and then we go to the province. Once a year there ought to be a province meeting. Other than talking with people who are in the church business, I don't know if anyone knows about a province. It would be a sweet, sweet thing to do.
Yeah.
So thank you.
I would also suggest, if we're making recommendations, is the Episcopal Youth Event only happens every 3 years. And it's an amazing opportunity for several thousand youth to get it together across this country. But these kids' eyes, they're light up and like, wait, these people are Episcopalians too? And they don't know their friends in their classrooms are Episcopalians going to a different church in the same town. Never mind meeting someone from Hawaii or for them the Philippines or Taiwan. And so to me, a useful and visionary way for the church to move forward would be to say, let's bring our youth together more often. Most denominations do bring together their youth in huge numbers every year. And it's one of the things that it's on my heart, because these are the kids who are the leaders now in their world. Never mind the future of God's church. I don't know who I'm saying that to, but
Other,
who inspired me?
Sorry. Last comment is that, I'm glad to hear of some progress and some hope and some excitement and some enthusiasm in our national church. It gives me hope. And I just hope that that hope will stay with me long enough to get some work done. There's an awful lot of work to get done there. I think things are getting worse in some of our most important areas of concern and conversation. I'll mention racism and the environment. Sorry, Cameron, I don't know enough. You got to step it up a little bit on the visibilities. But, we got an awful lot of work to do, so let's give thanks that we're, keeping our spirits up, too, because we need it. Thank you.
does someone have a comment or something that's inspired them to share with the group?
I guess what I would say, I think that's great what you're saying, and I, of course, the practical parish priest here, and that's why I was asking Cameron specifically, because we have at Emmanuel a couple of weddings coming up of gay couples, and that's what the November 7th date was. I was like, okay. And I do find that sometimes getting information out to people and getting the facts, even as I came today asking for facts. And I have so much more clarity, so I'm deeply grateful for this presentation. We had one in our Diocese of Rhode Island that was very helpful, and I asked the staff here today when this would be available online, because what I'd like to do is just show the 3 presentations to my congregation, and I was told that I can do that today because it live stream. So that's so that's really helpful, because this was so incredibly informative in a much better way than reading a book about General Convention. So I'm deeply grateful, because whoever organized it this way, these are the 3 areas that, when we at our diocesan level had a presentation, we most focused on. Because at the end of the day, it's like, what is in it, the local level? Because that's where it's all heading, the local congregation. So I'm deeply grateful for all the work that has made real changes at the local level.
Thank you, Anita, for bringing to the focus that this will be available to be watched later. And so watch the live stream address on the EDS website for when it'll be available to share with your congregation or others. Did anyone here have a comment or?
I wanted to mention, and maybe Byron would be able to talk more about it, but the other important conversation that happened was about alcohol use. And there was an amazing task force just assigned for that, and a lot of passion. I mean, I sat in the gallery listening to the debates both in the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops about, how do we be authentic, and how do we be real, how do we be pastorally caring for the people who are struggling with the addiction, for people who are affected by the addiction, but also realize that our church, has been embedded in some of these conversations and been, maybe not as open about the reality of alcohol use in our communities of faith. And so I was inspired by the openness and the willingness of people to get up there and witness in all different ways. From people who believe that Theology on Tap, which is a program that young adults have been doing around the church, is a really important way to engage young people. Having a conversation at a bar with a beer is sort of a way to invite people in, to other people who felt, we need to go a different route, and that's just not a way to live. So I don't know if you have anything more to add, but I actually do think it was one of the biggest outcomes of General Convention. One of many. But.
I thank you for bringing that up. And one of the things that, just sitting last night and this morning trying to figure out what I was going to talk about was going through all the stuff we did. We do a lot of work at convention, and but I think what's so important about the whole question, the way we dealt with the whole issue of alcohol was, one of the people argue one of the arguments about the structure of the Episcopal Church is that we're not nimble, and I think there's a perfect example of being nimble. We were brought to this because of a tragic situation in Maryland. It brought this to people's minds, and people wanted to know what had we said, and how come we weren't saying anything at that moment. And very quickly, we were able to gather together a group of people, and in a few months, have a document that we were able to have serious debate with, and have resolutions that make a lot of sense. Now, of course, one of the things about this, it is something we've thought about before. And so one of the things we need to figure out is, how do we keep before the church what the church has worked very hard on saying,
right.
and then what happens 15 years after they've said it, right?
Because we recreate everything new.
I remember the convention when we did the alcohol, the statement on alcoholism, and set the guidelines that we hoped everybody would follow.
Thank you for bringing that to the attention of the group. There are handouts about the resolutions and the work that was done. We're proud to have an alum, Kevin Cross, from class of '08, who's very involved in this. And so you're welcome to the yellow sheets, and you can also find a story from Episcopal News Service just on that those resolutions regarding the issue of alcohol and drug abuse. So thank you for bringing that up. I think it's time to move towards closing worship. So I invite you to find, again, your green sheet. And before we close with worship, I just want to say that this morning has been enlightening and also inspiring to me. People have already commented on the joy and hope that's come out of your three presentations, and I share that and hope you do too. And so I want to thank our presenters for being here and for the work you do behind the scenes, and thank you. And we hope to have other conversations about what's happening that's come out of General Convention and other resolutions. So watch your EDS website for other conversations. And so now we'll gather together for the closing worship. And it begins on the second page. And today we heard at the beginning God's message of, I am about to do a new thing. And we've heard how those new things have been resolved for us to be about that work. And so in closing prayer, we'll be invited to contemplate the ways in which we are invited to that work as individuals, as leaders of communities, and as part of the church whole. And we're called to the growing edge, that place where things are dying, and also that same place where things are being born. God has called us in righteousness.
Let us respond with justice.
A reading from Howard Thurman. All around us, worlds are dying and new worlds are being born. All around us, life is dying and life is being born. The fruit ripens on the tree. The roots are silently at work in the darkness of the earth against a time when there shall be new lives, fresh blossoms, green fruit. Such is the growing edge. It is the extra breath from the exhausted lung, the one more thing to try when all else has failed, the upward reach of life when weariness closes in upon all endeavor. This is the basis of hope in moments of despair, the incentive to carry on when times are out of joint and men have lost their reason, the source of confidence when worlds crash and dreams whiten into ash. The birth of a child, life's most dramatic answer to death. This is the growing edge incarnate. Look well to the growing edge.
And so I invite you to a moment of silence to consider what you experience at the growing edge in your own ministry or in the life of your faith community, in the church and the world. What experience are you having at that growing edge of a place where things are dying and also being born? Please join me in prayer. Living God, spring of all creation, sometimes it is difficult for us to know how to be faithful.
Help
Help
us discern your will and follow you with gladness.
Living God, font of comfort and strength, we see the brokenness of our communities and our world. Help us to be people who faithfully bring forth justice. Living God, cradle of healing, we know the world longs for healing.
Help us be people of hope and bearers of light.
Living God, ever-present companion, we want to be the people you long for us to be. Help us walk in your way of love. And I invite your prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving silently or aloud.
Pray for the Pope and his coming visit. People may open their hearts and minds to his messages.
Pray for all the deputies and bishops who are at General Convention in their work of interpreting what we did over the next 3 years.
I give thanks for the inspiration and hope that was spread today.
Pray that sense of hope and renewal will infuse difficult conversations that we will continue to need to have in the church for the next few years.
Please join me now in the words of the Lord's Prayer that's in the form closest to your heart. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial, and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. Loving God, we seek to know and follow you more faithfully. We pray you will open and fill our hearts with the love and knowledge of your Son, Jesus. May we see ever more clearly what it is you call us to, and may we respond with lives of joy and justice. Amen. God has called us in righteousness. Let us respond with justice. Thank you, everyone, for being engaged with EDS this way this morning. We hope you'll come back and visit us again. Thank you.
Thank you.